Thank you for joining us for another Tuesdays with Trey. I'm grateful for your time. Today, I have three things on my mind, and I hope you will find each of them relevant to your own life. Let's call these three things: number one, second chances; number two, starting over; and number three, saying goodbye. I want to start with second chances and the power and rarity of second chances. John Ratcliffe was sworn in as the Director of National Intelligence last week. It's a supremely important job, and I admit up front my bias towards John Ratcliffe. Other than Tim Scott, John Ratcliffe was my closest friend in the House and the person I spent the most amount of time with. And toward the end of my time in D.C., it was Tim Scott, John Ratcliffe, and Kevin McCarthy, the four of us spending as much time as we possibly could with each other in those final months. I was on committees with Johnny. We ate dinner together, oftentimes with Tim and Kevin or some combination. I visited John's house in Texas, and he's visited our home in South Carolina. We played golf together. We've traveled together. We've been through happy times and miserable times together. I really can't imagine not being friends with John Ratcliffe at this point in life, but it is the power of second chances that allowed that to happen. John Ratcliffe first ran for Congress in 2014 in the Republican primary in Texas against the incumbent, a congressman named Ralph Hall. And that's a lonely thing to do, run against an incumbent. I know how lonely it is. I've done it. Ralph Hall was well-liked. He was a lot older than I was, and we didn't hang out together while I was in Congress, but some of the other folks in the Texas delegation asked me to record some radio spots and record some messages for Ralph. So I did. In essence, I endorsed Ralph Hall over John Ratcliffe in their contested GOP primary for Congress. When someone else endorses your opponent over you, you take it personally. I can also vouch for that firsthand. I had never met John. I didn't know much about him. But still, when you get involved in other people's races, the other person is going to remember it. And it will have, shall we say, a chilling effect on your relationship going forward. My wife, to this day, can remember the names of every person who did not endorse me when I ran for district attorney in South Carolina all the way back in 2000. It's a very, very long list of people who did not endorse me, so she must have a really good memory. She is otherwise the sweetest, kindest person you will ever meet, but she can remember the names of everyone who did not help her husband. Like I said, you take it personally when someone endorses your opponent. It's just human nature. Well, Johnny won that primary over Ralph Hall in the summer of 2014, so much for my endorsement of Ralph Hall. I chalked it up after I'd heard the one to my bad judgment. I reminded myself for the 1,000th time how stupid it is to get involved in other people's races. And I sort of moved on in my head. We were not likely to be around each other much when he made it to Congress in January, is what I told myself. So I'll just chalk it up to my bad judgment. I'll probably never have a relationship with him, and I kind of put it out of my mind. How wrong I was. During the very first vote series, on the very first day, John Ratcliffe has barely been sworn into Congress. And I see him walking towards where I was sitting on the floor of the House. So I say to myself, dear Lord, please let him keep walking. Please let him walk towards somebody else. Please do not let him stop and talk to me. I don't want to have an argument with him on the first day on the job. I don't want to have an uncomfortable conversation with him on the floor of the House on his very first day on the job. Thinking to myself, I tried to keep him from winning. I endorsed his opponent. I cut radio spots for his opponent. I made recorded calls for his opponent. It's swearing in day. It's his first day on the job. His whole family's up in the gallery. I'm sure they hate me as much as he does. Please do not come over this way. And I had my head down like we all do when we don't want to make eye contact with somebody, but we're still sort of looking anyway to see if they're headed towards us. And sure enough, John Ratcliffe walked straight up to me and said, "Hi, I'm John Ratcliffe. I was wondering if I could sit with you for a second and ask your advice about something." So we sat there for 20 minutes. And we discussed the vote series and the vote for speaker, which was very contentious on that day. We discussed committee assignments. He was so nice, so humble, so deprecating. It was impossible not to like him. Trust me, I tried, but it was impossible to not like him. And then as he stood up at the end of our conversation, he stuck out his hand and he said, Ralph Hall was a great man, and you were a good friend to him, and you should have been. And I hope over time you and I can be friends too. I mean, who does that? I mean, honestly, who does that? John Ratcliffe does. That's who. And that day began a friendship that has remained unabated since then. The man I tried to keep from getting to Congress became the person in the House who meant the most to me. The single nicest note I have ever gotten in my life was not from my wife of 31 years. It was not from my mom. It was not from either one of my two children. It was from John Ratcliffe. The day I announced I was not running for re-election. John Ratcliffe gave me a second chance. And because he gave me a second chance, I did not want to miss out on one of the most meaningful relationships I've ever had. So it was for that reason and 1,000 more that I was the happiest man in America when John Ratcliffe was confirmed and sworn in as the Director of National Intelligence. Happy for him, for his beautiful wife, Michelle, for their daughters, Riley and Darby, and for Johnny's mom and everyone else who cared about him. I was happy because the man who gave me a second chance did something even harder than that. He gave himself a second chance. You see, 9 months ago, John Ratcliffe was nominated to be the Director of National Intelligence, and after a miserable, painful week, he withdrew his name from consideration. Summer of 2019, I'm literally pulling into a beach house in South Carolina. First time my wife and kids and I have been to the beach together since 2010. We hadn't been in 9 years. Everyone is happy. We're excited. The weather's great. Literally, as I pull into the beach house, John calls to say the president's going to nominate him that day to be the Director of National Intelligence. And yet before the week had even ended, before we had packed up to come back from the beach, Johnny had withdrawn. Almost a solid week of print reporters who didn't know John, spent next to no time around John, had taken a hatchet to his resume, his time in the House, his career as a prosecutor. If you have never been on the receiving end of relentless criticism, it is hard to explain the impact it has on you. You are equal parts angry, you're embarrassed, but mainly you feel helpless watching a reputation that you spent 50 years developing being attacked and undercut and besmirched by Politico and the New York Times and CNN and the Washington Post. There was one reporter who was fair to John, Olivia Beavers from The Hill. Why? Because she knew him. She took the time to get to know him. Maybe it's easy to kick the hell out of someone when you think the sum total of their existence is that they're a Republican congressman from Texas who asks tough questions of law enforcement and prosecutors. If that's all you think he is or was, then maybe it's easy to do a hatchet job on someone. Johnny didn't withdraw because the allegations were true. Johnny withdrew because sometimes the path that seems the best is the quickest path. And that's for the well-being of your family and those you care about. You just want it to end. Your friends can call, and I know Tim Scott and Mark Walker and Kevin McCarthy called Johnny, and they try to encourage him, but you just want it to end. You want those you care the most about to stop having to watch your career and your reputation and your life's work relentlessly attacked. So as of early August 2019, John Ratcliffe was to some the man who was going to be the Director of National Intelligence and withdrew. That's what people who didn't know him thought. But life and the president gave John a second chance, and he took it.
For the full podcast, go to foxnewspodcast.com.